Let me share with you this morning the tale of a man, a woman, and their king. The king is that paradigm of wisdom and wealth in the ancient world that we're so familiar with. You might have in his place King Solomon, renowned throughout his land for his wisdom and for the resources at his command. And so a king in the ancient Near East would have acted as the ruler, the authority in the kingdom, but also the judge, the one to tell right from wrong and tell people what they ought to do. Sometimes even acting as an advisor to his subjects, and that's precisely what this story is about. You see, first to enter the august presence of the king, the royal court, is the man. And as he comes in, he observes the court officers surrounding the king, listening to what he has to say, because of course he is renowned in the land for his wisdom. The man strides in. He has come to his turn to speak with the king. And it seems, though he is a commoner, he has some sense of confidence entering the king's presence, as though he belongs there in some way. The king asks the man, after the usual bowing and greeting ritual, what he's come into his presence for, and he's asking for his help in the case of him and his neighbor. He suspects his neighbor of stealing something of his, but he's not caught the man, and he continually does it week after week. He asks the king, should he confront the man directly? Should he find the police and have them come to his home and search it? Should the king intervene somehow? And the king listens to his problem and decides then and there how he will help the man. That the king tells him to place something in his home that will mark the man who steals these items over and over again. As in modern parlance, it's the marked bills that explode with ink when stolen from the bank. A similar sort of thing is suggested by the king, a wise approach. The thief will be marked, and no one will be risked. No one will be harmed during it. And so the man who's approached still has his air of confidence, and he's listening keenly to what the king has to say, but in a somewhat removed way from what the king is saying. As he thanks him for his instruction and leaves his presence, it's still with that cool air of confidence. And it's notable to more than a few of the court officials that the man never actually says, "Thank you, king, I will do what you have said." And now the woman is the next person to come to see the king. And she is not the picture of self-confidence. She looks wretched and is almost stumbling into his presence, it seems. She's so weighed down, apparently, by her cares, she does not even look up at him, but bows before him and greets him. And then confesses. It just comes tumbling out of her wrongdoing. She's been caught up in some double dealing with her family. She owes them money, and she's about to be found out. She's scared to death. She doesn't know what's going to happen, and she doesn't know what to do. The king listens. And after a while, recommends that she seek forgiveness from her family, that she confess her wrong to them and repent. She's worried, though. She's thought of this, but she thinks, what if they won't forgive her? What if they won't continue accepting her? And he simply says, tell them that I have instructed you to do this. It may not fix everything, but it may help as well. The woman is thankful and vows to do precisely what the king has said, and quickly leaves his presence. Well, a day elapses, and the next morning, both the woman and the man are brought back into the king's presence. The woman simply comes to thank the king, to honor him. Her countenance has changed. There's a smile on her face. She's able to actually even raise her gaze to the king at one point. It's worked out precisely how the king had hoped that what her family has forgiven her, been restored to her, and though she needs to work to repay the money that she's taken from them, it seems all will be well once again. But the man is the exact opposite. Dejected. He comes into the king's presence not self-confident, not striding forward, chin held high, but rather dragged by the king's guards. It seems the man did not follow the king's advice. He thought better of it. He couldn't countenance the idea of this man stealing, his neighbor stealing further from him. And so he tried to catch him in the act and drag him away to the authorities. But the man fought back and protested and began to hit the man when he wouldn't let him escape. So the man fought back and ended up killing his neighbor. And so this man who had come seeking the advice of the king had failed to act on it, and in doing so, in going his own way, had committed heinous murder. And though the man pleaded his case and told the king it didn't make sense, the man was in his own home, he was the one who had robbed him, and the man was just defending himself, acting in self-defense, and it got a bit carried away. The king still looked at him and said, "You are still guilty, and what is more, you are a fool, for I told you the right way to go, and you would not obey. You listened to my sage and wise advice, renowned throughout the land, and you flung it aside because you thought your way was better. You truly are a fool." The book of James is probably the only book in the New Testament that we would classify as wisdom literature. That is, it spells out what it is to live a wise life, a righteous life, a good life. We might reflect its similarity in some ways to Proverbs, which would be part of the wisdom literature of the Old Testament. But particularly in our passage this morning, we're looking at what is wisdom and how do we get it. And so let's read this morning James chapter 1. We're going to read verses 5 to 8 and see this little portrait that James paints for us. "If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. But when you ask, you must believe and not doubt, because the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea, blown and tossed by the wind. That person should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. Such a person is double-minded and unstable in all they do." So this fool that James describes, this doubting person, I'm going to label the supervisor this morning. We're going to look at the supervisor as described by James, God is described here, and a third figure I will call the supplicant. And we'll get to that person eventually. But the first one, the fool, I would call the supervisor. And I kind of do that in almost as I read this in sort of self-referential terms. I remember taking a Myers-Briggs test that described how you make decisions. And they described my decision-making as the supervisor. That is, I get input from people all around me and I listen to them, but I don't really give myself to them. I reserve decision for myself after collecting all this input and information. And this is kind of, I think, the picture that James has for us here of a foolish person going to God, asking for wisdom, but kind of reserving judgment for themselves. And I think that was the man in the story we began with this morning. A self-sufficient person, someone who's a bit reserved, a little bit aloof from God, willing to listen and hear what he has to say, but kind of self-confident enough to not always heed it, not always obey. There's a bit of a haughtiness, a bit of calculated reserve that probably isn't always apparent to the people around them. This is what James calls foolish behavior, a foolish way of living life. Outwardly, this person seems very steady. They're cool and calculating. They're listening and taking it all in. But when it comes to God, the same attitude cannot pervade our relationship with Him. Actually, this apparent steadiness from the outside, James says, no, this person is unstable. They're like a wave tossed and blown by the wind. Calls them unstable. Double-minded, actually, in verse 8 is the word there. And the Greek word is actually daisukos, which is a kind of a rare word that James used, but if we think of psyche and die meaning two, it kind of gives us this idea of split personality. They're of two completely different minds. And I think that struck me this week because as I think through my own personality, my own decision making, I'm often of two or even more minds. The complicated issues confound me, and I need the Lord's wisdom. Otherwise, I'd just be stymied with all the information. But the real issue here between the supervisor, as I've called him, and God is that the supervisor doubts. It says that if any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. A very simple proposition, but it says, but when you ask, you must believe and not doubt. When we read that seems strange. It seems, I think, a good verse for televangelists. The power of your belief. It seems to be where this verse is going. But as I've pondered it over the years, I think James is saying something quite different, actually. Is he, with doubt, is he describing a situation where we wonder, in God revealing His will, whether that it truly is His will or not? No, I don't think he actually is. I think that is actually a good thing. Call it skepticism, call it what you want. We could call it discernment. That is trying to figure out what God's will is in a particular situation. And we're told in the process that God will reveal that. But we have to work into it. We have to exercise discernment. And so I don't think James is speaking about that. I think the kind of doubt he's talking about runs in a different direction. I think, first off, he's saying we can't doubt that God is for us. Interestingly, a lot of people love to go to Romans chapter 8 to say that God is for us, that neither height nor depths will separate us from the love of God. And further to that well, let's read it. Make sure I get it right. I obviously don't have Romans 8:28 memorized the way I could. But we've talked about this before, and so I won't spend a lot of time, but it says in Romans 8:28, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. And we know that reading that as a blanket statement that God is always going to do what you want or make everything turn out positive is not exactly what that is stating. It says that God is determinedly working towards His good in your life. That is, that you are becoming a mature follower of Jesus Christ, no matter what. And so is God for you? Well, yes, He certainly is, but maybe not in the way you're expecting. He's for you in a way that you ultimately bring Him glory. Because if He was for you so that you could be self-glorified, He'd be making you into a monster. He'd be making you into a demon. So God, yes, is for us. And we cannot doubt that when we ask for God's wisdom. I think we're also told not to doubt because we need to know that God knows better than us. And we can't doubt that. I think when we doubt that, that's where we get into this dangerous territory of hearing His wisdom, but God, do you really know what you're talking about? We maybe don't question it in so many words, but we often think, I think my way of doing it sounds better somehow. We doubt that God's way is best. We look at His way of approaching things, and for whatever reason, maybe it's our experience from our workplace, or maybe it's something that we've learned in our education, or maybe it's just experience at home. We said, I've tried it that way, God, and it just doesn't work. Your way, for all the good it seems to do appears foolishness. And Paul has some pretty explicit words to say on that account. And so I want to flip there to 1 Corinthians chapter 1. Paul gives an excellent summary of the message of the cross, that it is in fact foolishness. That when we look at it, God's sacrifice of his own son appears foolishness. How could that be wisdom? But Paul sums it up in verse 25 of 1 Corinthians chapter 1 this way. He says, "For the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength." Often God's way does appear foolishness to us, but it still means that his way is best. It just means that we've been so lulled into the world's way of doing things, lulled into our own way of doing things, that we can't apprehend the beautiful wisdom of God. And so when we ask God for wisdom, as James describes, we have to do it without doubting. That is to say, not so much doubting the discernment process, but doubting God himself. We don't want to doubt his goodness. He is the giver of every good and wonderful gift, as James will tell us. And so let's look at some of this description of God in here. He gives generously, it says in verse 5. God who gives generously, freely. There's this idea behind this that he's not making a judgment call in giving. He just rains his mercy down on us. Jesus points out in the Sermon on the Mount that he sends his rain on the wicked and the righteous alike, that God's gifts abound to us. And James comes back to this in verse 17 of chapter 1. "Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows." God is always in the business of giving generously, and he does it without finding fault. What grace and wisdom God provides to us without finding fault. I think that's the thing. That's maybe why I cast the woman as to be held up in the story at the beginning, because we want to find fault. We want to see where somebody has done wrong and not be kind to them because of it. We want to visit retribution on them, and instead God says, "No, here's my wisdom. If you're truly repentant, if you're truly going to leave your way and go your own, and go mine, then here's my wisdom." But I think the message here, the underlying message, is that if you're going to cast aside God's wisdom, if you're going to hear it but not put it into practice, if you're going to sit before the king but not obey him, then he's not going to cast his pearls before swine. Another one of Jesus' sayings. Verse 7 that we just read. That person who doubts God, that person should not expect to receive anything from the Lord. So we have the supervisor, I think, described as outwardly perhaps successful and self-sufficient, self-confident, but appearances can be deceiving. We have God as gracious and wise. And I think there's a picture in it here for us as the supplicant, the person who comes asking for God, praising him and willing to show gratitude and honor him because of his wisdom. And a lot of the language of James is a negative example in these verses, but I think we can picture this supplicant nonetheless. It is somebody who is wise, though perhaps by the world's standards seems foolish. There's a certain humility about them. They know what they don't know. They see that their strength and influence only goes so far, and that they are ultimately reliant on God. That they cannot know and understand everything that happens in their world. And this is the humility that God calls us to as his worshipers. I think there's also some indifference there. I've been reading a book by Ruth Haley Barton for the class I've been taking these last few weeks. And she talks a lot about something she calls a prayer of indifference in discerning God's will. And the important point she makes is this. Indifference is maybe a weird word to us in terms of prayer, but she's simply saying that we have to be indifferent to our own opinions. That it's okay to have an idea of how you would approach this situation that you're praying for wisdom for. It's okay to maybe have thought through how you would deal with it, but you need to be able to, in prayer, lay that aside and say, God, whatever your will is in this situation, I will do it. If you clearly show to me what you want me to do, I'm okay with that. I'm okay with not doing my own thing. And so we need that attitude of indifference, which I think comes out in James chapter 1. We need to be willing to put aside our own ideas, listen to God, and do what he says. When we can do that, then we are not unstable, not double-minded, but stable, firm in God's will, firm in the foundation of Jesus Christ's words. We are single-minded in our devotion to him, in our obedience to him. We're willing to ask for help because we know we don't have all the answers. And so when I think of that, I think of a number of saints I've known over the years who the world would classify as foolish, perhaps uneducated and lacking a breadth of experience that more cosmopolitan sort of liberal ideas would consider as somebody who has really lived the good life. But when I look at them through the lens of the gospel, I say, no, this may be a simple person, but they are incredibly wise. They've done the hard work of hearing God's voice and obeying it in their lives. Where else do we see this wisdom expressed? And perhaps you can think of an example for yourself, somebody that you truly think of as wise, not just smart, that is knowing many things, but actually being able to put their smarts into practice. Well, I think in Scripture, probably the most clear example for us for this kind of wisdom comes in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus' words, hear the tone of indifference. Nevertheless, Lord, not my will, but yours be done. That is the prayer of somebody seeking wisdom. Lord, here's everything that's going on. You know all about it. And this is what I would like to do. But ultimately, I most want to do your will and do things your way. Even with all the pain and violence that would be Jesus would be on the receiving end of in the next 24 hours, God's way was still the wisest and the best that he could imagine. And Jesus does that not just as an example for us, but he enters into that pain and suffering for us. Because he knows we are both foolish and often unwilling to pay the price of wisdom, to have the patience to let maturity develop. And so Jesus goes and in some way pays that price for us, that we would have access to God in a way that we could come and ask him anything, and he'd be glad. He'd be gracious. He'd be willing to pour himself out on us, unworthy creatures though we may be. And I think as we immerse ourselves in Jesus and the gospel, we can expect to appropriate that kind of wisdom, the kind of wisdom that says, Lord, I see the path ahead of me that you have planned out, and though it's painful and difficult, I'm willing to do it because I know it's your will. And that's precisely the kind of wisdom that James is talking about here. It's always helpful to read things in context. I think it's helpful here as we look at this word wisdom. The Greek word is Sophia, and that has a long and storied history in the Greek language, going back to Aristotle and Socrates, and you could make a lifetime study of that one single word. But note how James does it. What kind of wisdom is he talking about here? Well, I think we've already covered it in verses 2-4. It's the kind of wisdom that lets you persevere with joy throughout your life, even as you encounter trials. It's the kind of wisdom that brings you from a place of just living your life to receiving the crown of life at the end. Listen to how James describes wisdom later in chapter 3, verses 13 and 17. He says, "Who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show it by their good life, by deeds done in the humility that comes from wisdom." Interesting pairing there, humility and wisdom. We've talked about that already. Verse 17, "But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere." Maybe as we've read this first chapter this week and you think about the story I began with, you might be able to find yourself perhaps more in the role of the supervisor than the supplicant. I know I often do. I want to hear what God has to say, but I'm going to evaluate it on sort of my own paradigm, and we'll see if I follow through on what he has to say. But James instructs us that if we really want to be wise, we're going to listen to what God says. So Peter describes it as being like babies, craving pure spiritual milk from the Word. That's we're just going to take it and receive it and do it. And James enjoins us that is true wisdom. Wisdom that is only really given when we truly want it. Let's pray. Lord, awaken us a hunger and thirst for righteousness in such a way that when we come to you asking, Lord, for wisdom, for what your will is in whatever situation or difficulty we may be facing, that we would do so in such a way that our hearts would be open to you, that we'd be ready to receive your word, not just in a way of, oh, good to know, but in a spirit that says, tell me, Lord, speak, Lord, your servant is listening. I'm ready not just to hear your will, but to do it, to obey you. Thank you for Jesus, who makes it all possible. And as we come into your presence, ushered in on his account, Lord, we're aware already that we stand in great deficit, that we've often been foolish. We've often cast aside your direction and gone our own way, Lord. And so we thank you for your forgiveness and grace that ushers us back into your presence, that opens again the doors of wisdom in our life, Lord. And we thank you for never giving up on us. In Jesus' name, amen.